The dusty streets of Abiquiu, New Mexico, had never seen a woman quite like Georgiana Emerson, who stood on the warped wooden porch of her late husband's failing general store in the scorching June heat of 1882, watching the four girls she'd birthed chase tumbleweeds down the rutted main road while creditors circled like vultures waiting for her to admit defeat. She pressed her palm against the splintered doorframe, feeling the weight of 28 years bearing down on shoulders that had grown thin from worry and too many meals skipped so her daughters could eat. Knowing that Samuel had been dead nearly 8 months now, and every merchant in town whispered that a widow with 4 mouths to feed and no sons to help work the land had about as much chance of survival as a prairie flower in a drought. The youngest, 4-year-old Margaret, tumbled into the dirt, her pinafore already stained beyond recognition, while 10-year-old Ruth tried to corral her back toward the store. 8-year-old Constance had climbed onto the water trough, balancing precariously while 12-year-old Dorothy stood watch, her face already showing the serious expression of a girl who understood their circumstances far too well. Georgiana felt her throat tighten as she watched them, these 4 beautiful disasters who laughed, despite having holes in their shoes and ate beans for dinner 5 nights a week, because that was all she could afford after paying what little she could toward the mounting debts Samuel had left behind. The bank had sent another letter that morning, tucked under her door like a death sentence written in careful script. She had 30 days to make a payment of $200, or they would seize the store and the small house behind it where her daughters slept 3 to a bed. $200 might as well have been $2,000 for all the chance she had of scraping it together. The store barely brought in enough to keep them fed, and every rancher or cowboy who came through town looked at her with either pity or something darker that made her skin crawl, and her hand reach instinctively for the rifle Samuel had taught her to shoot before the fever took him. She was about to call the girls inside when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the western road, the steady rhythm of a single horse moving at an easy pace. Georgiana shaded her eyes against the brutal sun and watched as a rider emerged from the heat shimmer that made the desert landscape dance and blur at the edges. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat pulled low over his face and a blue shirt that had seen better days but was clean and carefully mended. His horse was a sturdy paint, well cared for despite the long miles of dust coating its legs. The cowboy slowed as he reached the main stretch of Abiquiu, taking in the scatter of buildings that made up their small town with the interested gaze of someone seeing a place for the first time. His eyes swept past the saloon, the church with its whitewashed walls, the blacksmith shop where Martinez worked his forge even in the oppressive heat, and finally settled on her store and the 4 girls who had stopped their game to stare at this stranger with open curiosity. He dismounted in one fluid motion, looping his reins over the hitching post outside the store with practiced ease. As he stepped onto the porch, Georgiana got her first clear look at his face and felt something unexpected flutter in her chest before she firmly tamped it down. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30 or 31, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors and eyes the color of the summer sky that crinkled at the corners when he smiled at her daughters. "Afternoon, madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that felt genuine rather than mocking. His voice was low and pleasant, carrying the slight drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. "Name's Isaac Vaughn. I'm looking for work in these parts, and I heard in Santa Fe that Abiquiu might have need of an extra hand." Georgiana straightened her spine, aware of how she must look with her faded calico dress and hair escaping its pins, aware too of how the girls had gone silent and were watching this exchange with bright, hopeful eyes that broke her heart. This is a general store, Mr. Vaughn, not a ranch. I'm afraid I can't help you. Well now, I can see that, he said easily, not moving to leave. But I also see you've got a porch rail here that's about to give way, and those steps look like they might collapse if someone heavy as me takes them wrong. I'm handy with repairs, madam, and I don't need much. Room in a barn and a meal or two would suit me fine while I look around for something more permanent. I don't have a barn, Georgiana said flatly, though something in his manner made her want to say yes despite every practical objection her mind raised. And I certainly don't have money to pay for repairs. Isaac nodded slowly, his gaze taking in the peeling paint on the store's facade, the crooked sign that read Emerson's General Goods, and the four girls who had crept closer during their conversation. Those your daughters, madam? She felt her jaw tighten defensively. They are. Fine-looking girls, he said, and there was nothing but genuine warmth in his voice. I bet they keep you busy. Dorothy, always the bold one, spoke up before Georgiana could respond. Our pa died of fever last winter. Mama runs the store all by herself now, and we help when we can, but the bank says we might lose it if we can't pay them $200. Dorothy, Georgiana's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. That is not something you discuss with strangers. But Isaac's expression had shifted to something thoughtful, his blue eyes moving from the girls back to Georgiana with a new understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, madam. That's a hard burden for anyone to carry, let alone. We manage, Georgiana said stiffly, wishing desperately that Dorothy had kept her mouth shut, wishing this cowboy would mount his horse and ride away so she could stop feeling the sting of shame at having their poverty laid bare before him. I'm sure you do, Isaac said quietly. He was silent for a moment, seeming to wrestle with something internal, then he cleared his throat. Mrs. Emerson, is it? It is. She didn't bother asking how he knew. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone's business, and clearly her daughters were happy to share theirs with passing strangers. Mrs. Emerson, I've got a proposition that might sound strange, but I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out. He shifted his weight, and Georgiana noticed for the first time that he seemed almost nervous, a curious vulnerability in a man who otherwise carried himself with quiet confidence. I've been working cattle drives for near about 12 years now, saved up a decent amount because I had nothing particular to spend it on. I'm tired of the trail, tired of sleeping on hard ground and eating dust. I'm looking to settle down, maybe start a ranch of my own or work steady for someone else. Georgiana waited, uncertain where this was leading, her hand gripping the porch post until her knuckles went white. Thing is, Isaac continued, I always thought when I settled down I'd have a family. A wife, children, a home that meant something. I'm not a young man anymore, Mrs. Emerson, and the years pass faster than a person realizes. He met her eyes directly, and she saw something honest and almost desperate in his expression. I've got money saved up. Not a fortune, but enough to clear your debt with the bank and keep this store running proper. And I've got 2 strong hands and a willingness to work harder than any man you'll find in 3 territories. Mr. Vaughn, I don't understand what you're suggesting, Georgiana said, though a wild hope was beginning to flutter in her chest like a caged bird testing the bars. I'm suggesting marriage, madam. The words came out in a rush, as though he needed to say them before he lost his nerve. I know that sounds insane, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but I'm a decent man. I don't drink to excess, I don't gamble, and I don't raise my hand to women or children. I'm offering to marry you, pay off your debts, and help you raise those 4 beautiful girls like they were my own. In return, I'd get what I've been wanting for years now, a family and a place to call home. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the porch boards and Margaret's small gasp of surprise. Georgiana stared at this stranger, who had ridden into town not 10 minutes ago, and was now proposing to upend her entire life with an offer that was either the answer to her desperate prayers or the worst decision she could possibly make. "You don't even know me," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, madam, I don't," Isaac admitted. "But I know you're raising 4 daughters on your own in the hardest territory God ever made, and you're still standing. I know those girls are clean and fed, even if the clothes are patched and the food is simple. I know you haven't given up, even though I'd wager most people expected you to by now. That tells me more about your character than a year of courting might." Ruth tugged on Georgiana's skirt, her voice urgent. "Mama, he could save the store. He could help us." "Hush, Ruth," Georgiana said automatically, but her mind was spinning through the impossible mathematics of her situation. She had 30 days and no prospects. No man in Abiquiu had shown any interest in taking on a widow with 4 daughters. The few who had approached her had made it clear they expected something other than marriage in exchange for their help, and she'd sent them packing with words sharp enough to cut leather. But this man, this Isaac Vaughn, was offering everything she needed with an honesty that seemed almost too good to be true. "Why?" she asked suddenly. "Why would you do this? There are single women everywhere who would marry you without the complication of 4 children." Isaac's face softened, and he glanced at the girls who were watching him with a mixture of hope and suspicion. "My mama died when I was young, and my pa raised me and my 3 sisters on his own. I watched him work himself near to death trying to be both parents to us, and I always swore that if I had the chance to help someone in that situation, I would. As for children," he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered face, "I always wanted a full house. Figured it might be nice to skip the diaper years and start with kids who can hold a conversation." Despite everything, despite the impossibility of the situation and the fear clutching at her heart, Georgiana felt a laugh bubble up in her throat. It emerged as something between a sob and a chuckle, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the sudden rush of emotions threatening to break through the careful control she'd maintained for 8 months. "This is crazy," she said when she could speak again. "Yes, madam, I expect it is," Isaac agreed. "But sometimes crazy is exactly what a situation calls for. I'm not asking you to love me, Mrs. Emerson. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove I'm a man of my word. We can go to the bank right now if you want. I'll show you I have the money. We can talk to Father Rodriguez at the church, get his opinion on my character. I've got references from ranchers I've worked for from here to Austin. I'm not asking you to trust me blindly." Georgiana looked at her daughters, at Dorothy's serious face and Ruth's hopeful eyes, at Constance, who was chewing her lip nervously, and little Margaret, who had wrapped her arms around Georgiana's leg as though afraid she might blow away. She thought about the letter tucked in her apron pocket, about the weight of debt and responsibility that had been crushing her slowly for months. She thought about Samuel, who had been a good man but not a practical one, who had loved her but had left her in an impossible situation. "If I agree to this," she said slowly, "there would need to be rules, understanding between us." Isaac nodded immediately. "Of course. Whatever you need, madam. You would sleep in the store, not in our house, until we know each other better, until I'm comfortable. The girl's welfare comes before everything else, including your pride or your comfort or mine. And if at any point I feel they're in danger or being treated poorly, the arrangement ends. I don't care about the money or the debt. My daughters are everything." "I wouldn't expect anything different," Isaac said quietly. "And I agree to all of it. You set the pace, Mrs. Emerson. I'm patient." She drew in a deep breath, feeling as though she stood at the edge of a cliff with no choice but to jump. "Then yes, Mr. Vaughn, I'll marry you." The next 3 days passed in a blur that left Georgiana dizzy and uncertain. Isaac proved as good as his word, first taking her to the Abiquiu bank where he spoke with Mr. Henderson in low, firm tones, and then wrote a check that made Georgiana's knees go weak when she saw the amount. $250, enough to clear her debt with room left over to restock the store's depleted shelves. Mr. Henderson, who had looked at her with barely disguised contempt every time she'd come to beg for more time, suddenly became obsequious and eager to help, offering his congratulations on her upcoming marriage with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Father Rodriguez had been more genuinely warm, though clearly concerned about the rushed nature of the engagement. He'd spoken with Isaac privately for over an hour while Georgiana waited in the church garden with her daughters, pulling at weeds and trying not to imagine all the ways this could go terribly wrong. But when they emerged, the priest had seemed satisfied, telling Georgiana that he believed Isaac to be sincere in his intentions, and that while the situation was unusual, he'd seen stranger marriages work out well in his 30 years serving the frontier communities. The wedding itself was small and quiet, held on a Thursday morning with only Father Rodriguez, the girls, and Mrs. Martinez from the boarding house as witnesses. Georgiana wore her best dress, a dark green cotton that she'd made herself 3 years ago and only brought out for church, and Isaac had somehow procured a new shirt and had his hair trimmed by the barber. He looked almost handsome standing at the altar, Georgiana thought distantly, then felt guilty for thinking it when Samuel had been dead less than a year. But Samuel was dead, and she was alive, and she had 4 daughters who needed food and shelter, and a future that didn't involve working themselves to exhaustion in their teenage years. So she repeated the vows Father Rodriguez prompted, her voice steady even though her hands trembled, and she let Isaac slide a simple gold band onto her finger. When the priest told him he could kiss his bride, Isaac had leaned in and pressed the gentlest kiss to her cheek, so quick and chaste that it barely registered before he pulled away. "Thank you," he'd whispered, so quietly only she could hear, and Georgiana had nodded because she didn't trust her voice not to break. The girls had been excited but confused by the sudden changes, peppering both Georgiana and Isaac with questions about what it meant that he was their stepfather now, whether they should call him Pa or something else, and where he would sleep. Isaac had been patient with every question, crouching down to their level to explain that he would be living at the store for now, but that he hoped eventually to earn their trust and become a real part of their family. He told them they could call him whatever felt comfortable, and that he understood this was strange for them too. That first night as a married woman, Georgiana had lain awake in the bed she'd shared with Samuel, listening to her daughters breathe in the darkness, and wondered what on earth she'd done. She'd married a complete stranger, tied her life and her daughters' futures to a man she knew nothing about beyond a few references and a priest's blessing. If he turned cruel, if he drank, if he proved to be a liar or worse, she would have no recourse. The law saw women as property of their husbands, and she just handed herself and everything she had over to Isaac Vaughn. But the morning came with surprising normalcy. Isaac was already up when she walked over to the store just after dawn, having somehow procured coffee and bacon and fresh eggs that he was cooking on the small stove in the back room where he'd set up a makeshift living space. He looked up when she entered, his hair still damp from washing, and offered her a cup of coffee with a tentative smile. "Morning, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, and Georgiana felt a jolt at the name that was now hers. "Georgiana is fine," she said quietly, accepting the coffee. "Or Georgie, if you prefer." "That's what Samuel called me. Georgiana," Isaac repeated, as though testing how it felt in his mouth. "That's a beautiful name. My friends call me Isaac, but my sisters always called me Ike when they wanted to tease me." "How many sisters did you say you had?" Georgiana asked, seizing on the opportunity to learn more about this man who was now her husband. "3. Older than me by 2, 4, and 6 years. Mary, Caroline, and Beth. They all married and moved away, started families of their own. Last I heard, Mary was in Oregon, Caroline in California, and Beth in Missouri. We write when we can, but it's been a few years since I've seen them in person." There was a wistfulness in his voice that made Georgiana soften slightly. "You must miss them," she said. "I do," Isaac admitted. "But that's the nature of growing up out here. Families scatter like dandelion seeds, hoping to take root wherever the wind blows them." He flipped the bacon, the smell making Georgiana's stomach growl embarrassingly loud. Isaac pretended not to notice. "I thought maybe we could all have breakfast together this morning, if that's all right with you. Give the girls a chance to get to know me a bit better." It became a pattern over the following weeks. Isaac would wake early and prepare breakfast. Something simple but more substantial than the cornmeal mush or stale bread that had been their usual fare. Georgiana and the girls would come over from the house, and they'd eat together in the back room of the store, the conversation awkward at first but gradually becoming more natural. Isaac asked the girls about their interests, their friends, their dreams, and he listened with genuine attention when they answered. Dorothy, the eldest, remained suspicious and protective, watching Isaac's every interaction with her mother and sisters with narrowed eyes. But Ruth, always quick to trust, had warmed to him almost immediately, chattering about the stray dog she'd been feeding and the book she was trying to read. Constance was shy but curious, occasionally asking Isaac questions about his horse or where he'd traveled. And Margaret, too young to remember Samuel clearly, had declared within the first week that she liked Isaac because he was tall and could lift her up to see things. Isaac kept his word about everything. He slept in the store, never pushing boundaries or making Georgiana uncomfortable. He spent his days repairing everything that had fallen into disrepair. The porch, the steps, the leaking roof, the warped floorboards inside the store. He rehung the sign so it no longer tilted drunkenly, replaced cracked window panes, and built proper shelving to replace the makeshift boards and crates Samuel had used. When customers came in, he was polite but deferred to Georgiana, making it clear that this was her store and he was there to help, not to take over. He also proved to be a shrewd businessman. He suggested new items they could stock that would appeal to the ranchers and travelers passing through, negotiated better prices with suppliers in Santa Fe, and convinced several local families to set up accounts at the store instead of making the long trip to larger towns for their goods. Within a month, the store was turning a small profit for the first time since Samuel's death. But it was the small moments that began to chip away at Georgiana's careful defenses. The way Isaac always made sure she had the most comfortable chair at breakfast. The time he'd noticed her rubbing her temples and had quietly brewed her willow bark tea without being asked. The afternoon she'd found him sitting with Constance, patiently teaching her to whittle a small horse from a piece of wood, his voice gentle as he guided her hands. The evening she'd caught him letting Margaret braid his hair with wildflowers while he pretended to read the newspaper, his lips twitching with suppressed laughter at something Ruth was saying. He was kind. Not just polite or dutiful, but genuinely kind in a way that seemed as natural to him as breathing. He never complained about the cramped quarters where he slept or the simple food, or the constant noise and chaos of 4 energetic girls. He praised Georgiana's cooking even when she knew the biscuits were tough and the stew was thin. He complimented her business sense and asked her opinion on every decision regarding the store. He treated her not as property or as someone whose will didn't matter, but as a partner whose thoughts and feelings were important. It terrified her how much she was beginning to rely on him, how much easier everything felt with him there. She found herself looking forward to the mornings when they'd have coffee together before the girls woke, talking quietly about nothing important. She noticed things she hadn't let herself notice at first. The way his shoulders filled out his shirt, the flash of his smile, the calluses on his hands from years of hard work. She caught herself wondering what it would be like if their marriage was real in every sense, then felt guilty because Samuel's grave wasn't even a year old yet. 2 months after the wedding, on a sweltering August evening, everything changed. Georgiana had sent the girls to bed early and was finishing the accounts at the small desk in the store's back room when Isaac came in from checking on his horse. He'd been quiet all day, she'd noticed, distracted in a way that wasn't like him. "Something on your mind?" she asked, setting down her pencil. Isaac pulled off his hat, turning it in his hands. "I've been thinking I might look into buying some land just outside town. There's a parcel about a mile south that's going cheap because the previous owner couldn't make it work. It's got a small house on it, nothing fancy, but it's bigger than what you've got now. Has a barn too and enough land to run some cattle or horses." Georgiana's heart sank, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. Of course he wanted his own place. Of course he was tired of living in a storeroom, of this strange arrangement where he was married, but not really. She'd known this moment would come eventually, had known he'd want to move on to something more permanent. "That sounds like a good opportunity," she managed. "I was thinking," Isaac continued, not meeting her eyes, "that maybe you and the girls might want to come see it. See if you think it would suit. I know the house you're in now is small and it's attached to the store, which means you never really get away from work. This place has a porch with a view of the mountains, and there's a creek running through the back of the property where the girls could play without worrying about getting trampled by horses on the main road." "You want us to see your new house," Georgiana said, trying to keep the hurt from her voice. "Our house," Isaac said, finally looking up at her. "Georgiana, I know we agreed to take things slow and I've tried to respect that, but these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. I wake up looking forward to breakfast with you and the girls. I go to sleep grateful that I get to do it all again the next day. Those 4 daughters of yours have burrowed their way into my heart until I can't imagine life without them." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "And you. Lord help me, Georgiana, but somewhere between fixing your porch and teaching Constance to whittle, I fell in love with you." Georgiana felt her breath catch, her hand gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to hurt. "Isaac, I'm not asking you to say it back," he said quickly. "I know you're not ready and maybe you won't ever be. But I need you to know that for me, this isn't an arrangement anymore. It's a marriage, a real one. And I'd like us to have a real home, all 6 of us together. We could keep running the store from town if you want, but we'd have a place to go at the end of the day that's ours, where the girls could have their own rooms and you could have space to breathe." She should tell him to slow down. Should remind him that Samuel had been dead less than a year, that she barely knew him, that love was a luxury she couldn't afford to think about when survival was all that mattered. But the words that came out of her mouth were different from what her practical mind insisted upon. "I think I'd like to see the property." The smile that spread across Isaac's face was like sunrise breaking over the desert, and Georgiana felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest that she'd thought died with Samuel. They rode out the next afternoon. All 6 of them crowded into the wagon Isaac had bought to make supply runs easier. The girls chattered excitedly, speculating about what the new house would look like, while Georgiana sat beside Isaac on the bench seat, acutely aware of his presence in a way she hadn't let herself be before. His arm brushed hers as he handled the reins, and she didn't pull away. The property exceeded her modest expectations. The house was small but solidly built, with wooden walls that had weathered to a soft gray and a roof that looked sound. There were 3 bedrooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with a real cook stove. The porch Isaac had mentioned wrapped around 2 sides of the house, offering views of the Jemez Mountains to the north and the winding ribbon of the creek to the south. The barn needed some work but was structurally intact, and the land itself, while scrubby and wild, had a harsh beauty that Georgiana found herself drawn to. The girls explored with shrieks of delight, racing from room to room and arguing over who would sleep where. Dorothy found the loft space above the bedrooms and immediately claimed it for herself, the first time Georgiana had seen her genuinely excited since Samuel's death. Ruth discovered wildflowers growing along the creek and began picking them with Constance. Margaret found a frog and insisted on showing it to Isaac, who examined it with appropriate seriousness before helping her release it back into the water. Georgiana stood on the porch, watching her daughters laugh and play without the weight of worry that had seemed to press them down for so long, and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Isaac came to stand beside her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. "They seem to like it," he said quietly. "They do," Georgiana agreed. She turned to look at him, this man who had appeared in her life like an answered prayer she hadn't known how to pray. "Isaac, last night you said something, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." He tensed slightly as though bracing for rejection. "About the house." "About love," she said, and watched his eyes widen. "I need you to understand something. When I married you, it was purely practical. I was desperate and you offered a solution. I didn't let myself think about feelings or romance or any of that because it seemed like an indulgence I couldn't afford." "I understand," Isaac said, and she could hear the resignation in his voice. "Let me finish," Georgiana said firmly. "What I'm trying to say, very poorly apparently, is that somewhere between you making breakfast and teaching my daughters to whittle and paying off my debts without making me feel like I owed you anything, I started to feel things I wasn't prepared for. I'm not sure I'm ready to call it love yet. It's too soon, and it feels like a betrayal of Samuel even though I know rationally that he'd want me to be happy." "Georgie," Isaac said, using the nickname for the first time, and the intimacy of it made her heart skip. "But I think I could love you," she continued, the words coming faster now as though she needed to get them all out before she lost her nerve. "I think maybe I'm already halfway there, and it scares me to death because this is all so fast and so strange, and what if it doesn't work out? What if you wake up one day and realize that 4 daughters is more than you bargained for, or that I'm too stubborn or too damaged or too boring?" Isaac reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, and his thumb stroked gently over her knuckles. "Georgiana Vaughn, I have spent 12 years sleeping on the ground and eating trail dust, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas and back again, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I've been thrown from horses, trampled by steers, caught in flash floods and dust storms. I've faced down rustlers and rattlesnakes and every kind of hardship the frontier could throw at me. And none of it, not one single moment, has scared me as much as the thought of you telling me this arrangement was all you'd ever want from me." Georgiana felt tears prickling at her eyes, her throat too tight to speak. "You're not boring," Isaac continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met. You're raising 4 daughters on your own in one of the harshest territories in America, and you're doing it with grace and dignity and love. You're not damaged, you're surviving, and stubborn," he smiled slightly. "Well, I'd be disappointed if you weren't. A man needs a wife who'll call him on his foolishness now and then." "I don't know how to do this," Georgiana whispered. "How to let myself feel this when Samuel's barely cold in his grave. How to trust that this is real and not just desperation making me see what I want to see." "Then we'll figure it out together," Isaac said simply. "We don't have to rush anything, Georgie. We can move into this house and keep separate rooms if that's what you need. We can take all the time in the world for you to be sure. I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, at this good man who had somehow become her husband, and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She leaned forward slowly, giving him the same chance to pull away that he'd given her, and pressed her lips to his. It was nothing like the chaste peck at their wedding or the kisses she'd shared with Samuel in their 7 years of marriage. It was soft and tentative and questioning, an exploration rather than a demand. Isaac went very still for a moment, as though afraid to move and break the spell. Then his free hand came up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her want to cry. He kissed her back with a sweetness that spoke of patience and promise and all the time in the world. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Georgiana rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart hammering beneath his shirt. His arms came around her, holding her securely but not tightly, and she let herself lean into the strength he offered. "We're going to be all right," she said, and for the first time in 8 months, she believed it. They moved into the house 2 weeks later, after Isaac had spent every spare moment making repairs and improvements. He'd fixed the loose boards in the porch, replaced the cracked window panes, and thoroughly cleaned every surface until the place gleamed. He'd also built a new bed frame for Georgiana's room, sturdy and well-made, with beautiful carved details on the headboard that must have taken him hours. The girls settled in with surprising ease, delighted by the novelty of having more space and the freedom to run wild on their own property. Dorothy's suspicion of Isaac had gradually transformed into grudging respect, especially after he'd sat down with her one evening and asked her seriously what she thought about taking on more responsibility in the store, treating her like an adult whose opinion mattered. Ruth had taken to following him around like a devoted puppy, always eager to help with whatever project he was working on. Constance had grown less shy, often bringing him her attempts at whittling for his critique and beaming when he praised her improving skill. And Margaret had decided that Isaac gave the best piggyback rides of anyone in New Mexico, and frequently ambushed him with demands to be carried. Georgiana watched these interactions with a mixture of joy and lingering fear. The girls were getting attached, deeply attached, and if something went wrong, it would break their hearts. But every day that passed, Isaac proved himself over and over. He was patient when Ruth accidentally spilled milk all over the breakfast he'd just made. He was understanding when Dorothy pushed back against his suggestions with all the attitude a 12-year-old could muster. He was gentle when Constance had nightmares and came stumbling out of her room in tears. He was playful when Margaret was cranky and needed distraction. And with Georgiana, he was something she'd never experienced before. He was a partner. He consulted her on every decision regarding the property or the store. He split the household duties without being asked, cooking some meals while she cooked others, helping with laundry and dishes without complaint. He listened when she talked about her day, asked questions that showed he was actually paying attention, and offered suggestions without being condescending. When she was tired, he'd gently steer her toward a chair and take over whatever task was exhausting her. When she was frustrated, he'd let her vent without trying to fix everything or dismiss her feelings. They still maintained separate bedrooms, but the space between them was gradually shrinking. They'd started sitting closer during meals, their shoulders touching. He'd taken to kissing her goodnight, sweet lingering kisses on the porch after the girls had gone to bed. She'd catch him watching her sometimes with an expression of such open affection that it made her breath catch. And she'd find herself doing the same, admiring the way he moved as he worked, the sound of his laugh, the patience in his voice when he explained something to one of the girls. 3 months after they'd moved into the house, in early November when the desert nights had turned cold enough to need a fire in the evenings, Georgiana made her decision. Isaac had been working all day building a chicken coop, and he'd come in for dinner smelling of sawdust and honest sweat. The girls had been particularly energetic, telling elaborate stories about a kingdom they'd invented in their play, and Isaac had participated with appropriate solemnity, asking questions about the royal lineage and the kingdom's laws. After the girls had finally been herded to bed, Georgiana and Isaac sat on the porch as had become their custom, wrapped in blankets against the chill and watching the stars emerge in the vast New Mexico sky. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that came from growing familiar with another person's presence. "Isaac," Georgiana said finally, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "I don't want separate rooms anymore." She felt rather than saw him go still beside her. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, as though afraid to presume. "What are you saying, Georgie?" "I'm saying that this hasn't felt like a real marriage because I wouldn't let it," she said, forcing herself to be brave. "I was protecting myself, protecting the girls, too afraid to trust that this could actually work. But you've proven yourself 100 times over. You're a good man, Isaac Vaughn, a better man than I probably deserve. And I don't want to keep holding you at arm's length when what I really want is to be your wife in every way." Isaac turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the dim light spilling from the windows. "Are you sure?" "Because, Georgie, I meant what I said about giving you all the time you need. I don't want you to feel pressured or like you owe me anything because of the money or the house or any of it." "I'm sure," Georgiana said, and realized as she spoke that it was true. The fear was still there, probably would always be there to some degree, but it was overshadowed now by certainty. "I love you, Isaac. I don't know exactly when it happened, but somewhere between you fixing my porch and winning over my daughters and just being exactly who you are every single day, I fell completely in love with you." The smile that spread across his face was incandescent, and then he was kissing her with a passion they'd both been holding back, his hands tangling in her hair while she gripped his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed kisses to her forehead, her cheeks, the tip of her nose. "I love you so much," he murmured against her skin. "God, Georgie, you have no idea how long I've wanted to hear you say that." She laughed, the sound bright and free in the cold night air, and took his hand. "Come on," she said, standing and pulling him with her. "Let's go to bed, together." The tenderness with which Isaac loved her that night erased any lingering doubts Georgiana might have harbored. He was patient and attentive, making sure she felt safe and cherished, murmuring words of love and devotion that made her heart feel too full for her chest. Afterward, lying wrapped in his arms with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Georgiana felt a peace she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. "Thank you," Isaac whispered into her hair. "For what?" she asked, tracing idle patterns on his chest. "For taking a chance on me, for letting me into your life and your heart, for trusting me with your daughters, for giving me the family I always wanted." His arms tightened around her. "I know I rode into town at the right moment, but Georgie, I believe you were always meant to be mine and I was always meant to be yours. We just had to find each other." Georgiana tilted her head up to kiss him softly. "I used to think love was something that happened to you like getting struck by lightning. Samuel and I fell in love when we were barely adults, and it felt exactly like that, sudden and overwhelming and out of our control. But this, what we have, this is different. We chose each other. We built this love deliberately, piece by piece, day by day, and I think maybe that makes it even stronger." "I think you're right," Isaac said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They fell asleep tangled together, and when Georgiana woke in the gray light of dawn, she had a moment of disorientation before remembering where she was and who was beside her. Isaac was still asleep, his face relaxed and peaceful, one arm draped across her waist possessively even in unconsciousness. She studied him in the quiet morning light, this man who had become her husband and her partner and her love, and felt grateful in a way that brought tears to her eyes. The sound of small feet in the hallway made her tense, and she glanced at the door nervously. But the footsteps passed by, heading toward the kitchen, and she heard Ruth's voice calling for Constance. She should get up, she thought, should start breakfast and begin the day. But Isaac's arm was warm and heavy across her, and the bed was comfortable. And for once, she let herself simply exist in this moment of contentment. Isaac stirred beside her, his eyes opening slowly. When he saw her watching him, his face transformed with a smile that was almost boyish in its delight. "Morning, wife," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning, husband," Georgiana replied and kissed him. The girls adjusted to their parents' new sleeping arrangement with minimal fuss. Dorothy, now 13 and increasingly aware of adult matters, had simply nodded knowingly when she'd noticed Isaac emerging from Georgiana's room at breakfast time. Ruth had asked with characteristic bluntness if this meant they were really married now, and had seemed satisfied when Georgiana confirmed that yes, they were. Constance and Margaret, too young to fully understand the implications, had simply been happy that everyone seemed happier. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost dreamlike to Georgiana in its normalcy. The store continued to prosper under their joint management, with Isaac handling the heavy work and supply runs while Georgiana managed the accounts and customer relations. They'd hired a local teenager, Miguel, to help out a few hours a week, which gave them more time to focus on the property and the girls. Isaac had started a small herd of cattle, just 10 head to begin with, and had plans to expand as they could afford it. He'd also bought chickens, which the girls took great delight in caring for, and had begun construction on a larger barn that would allow them to take in horses for boarding or training. His experience with cattle drives meant he understood horses better than most men, and word had spread quickly that Isaac Vaughn could gentle even the most difficult mount. The months passed in a blur of work and laughter and stolen moments of affection. Christmas came, their first as a real family, and Isaac had somehow managed to procure small gifts for each of the girls. A book for Dorothy, a wooden box for Ruth to keep her treasures in, a set of proper whittling tools for Constance, and a rag doll for Margaret that made her squeal with delight. For Georgiana, he'd given her a locket with a small photograph of all 6 of them that he'd arranged to have taken in Santa Fe, and she'd cried when she opened it. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer. The girls grew taller and more confident, secure in the stability that Isaac's presence provided. Dorothy began helping more in the store, showing a head for numbers that impressed both her parents. Ruth's stray dog had become an official family member, a scruffy mutt they'd named Rufus, who appointed himself guardian of the youngest girls. Constance's whittling had improved to the point where she'd made small animals that they sold in the store, and she glowed with pride every time someone bought one. Margaret started attending the small school in town and came home every day bursting with things to share. Georgiana had never been happier. She'd lie awake sometimes at night, wrapped in Isaac's arms, and marvel at how completely her life had transformed. A year ago, she'd been alone and terrified, certain that she'd lose everything. Now she had a partner who loved her, daughters who were thriving, and a home that felt secure in a way she'd never experienced before. It was in late August, almost exactly a year after Isaac had ridden into town, that Georgiana realized she'd missed her monthly courses. At first, she dismissed it as stress or maybe the beginning of some change in her body. But when a second month passed with no sign, accompanied by morning nausea and a tenderness in her breasts, she had to face the truth she'd been avoiding. She was pregnant. The realization filled her with a complicated mix of joy and terror. She'd loved being pregnant with each of her daughters, loved the feeling of growing life inside her, and the anticipation of meeting a new person. But she was also 33 now, older than she'd been with any of the others, and pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous even for young, healthy women. Samuel's mother had died bringing his youngest brother into the world. One of Georgiana's own friends had died of childbed fever just 3 years ago. And beyond the danger, there was the practical reality of another mouth to feed, another body to clothe and shelter. But underneath the fear, there was also a fierce happiness. This baby would be hers and Isaac's together, a product of the love they'd built rather than just the practical arrangement they'd started with. This baby would bind them together in a way nothing else could. She waited until the girls were asleep one night before telling Isaac. They were sitting on the porch as usual, and her hands were trembling as she took his and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Isaac," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her, immediately alert to the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said quickly. "At least, I don't think so. I'm pregnant. About 2 months along, I think." The expression that crossed Isaac's face was pure, unfiltered joy. His eyes went wide, his mouth dropping open slightly, and then he was laughing and pulling her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Georgie, we're going to have a baby. You're happy?" She asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy, I'm ecstatic. Terrified but ecstatic." He pulled back to look at her, his hands coming up to frame her face. "Are you all right? How are you feeling? Do we need to get you to a doctor?" "I'm fine," Georgiana assured him, though his concern warmed her. "Tired and nauseous in the mornings, but that's normal. I'll need to see the midwife in town soon, but Isaac, I'm 33. That's old to be having a baby. There are risks." "Then we'll be careful," Isaac said firmly. "You'll rest more, work less. The girls and I can handle the store and the property. Your job is to take care of yourself and our baby." Georgiana felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and Isaac kissed them away with infinite gentleness. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much." "I love you too," he replied. "You and the girls and this baby. You're my whole world, Georgie." Telling the girls brought varied reactions. Dorothy had looked shocked, then calculating, clearly doing the math in her head about when her mother and Isaac had become truly married. But then she'd smiled, a genuine expression of happiness, and said that a baby brother or sister would be nice. Ruth had immediately begun planning all the things she'd teach the baby, from how to catch frogs to the best places to find wildflowers. Constance had wanted to know if the baby would be able to help with the chickens, and had seemed satisfied when told that eventually, yes, they could. Margaret had been most concerned with whether the baby would take her toys, and had needed reassurance that she'd still be loved and important even with a new sibling. The pregnancy progressed normally, if uncomfortably. The morning sickness eased after the first trimester, but Georgiana grew large quickly, her belly swelling to an impressive size that made Isaac worry she was carrying twins. The midwife, Mrs. Patterson, assured them that everything seemed fine and that some women simply carried bigger. Isaac had been true to his word about making sure Georgiana rested. He'd taken over most of her duties in the store, though she still handled the accounts because sitting at a desk was manageable even heavily pregnant. He'd also been absurdly protective, constantly fussing over whether she was comfortable, if she needed anything, had she eaten enough. It would have been annoying if it hadn't been so clear how much he loved her. The girls had been wonderful too, each in their own way. Dorothy had started cooking dinner several nights a week, proving to be surprisingly talented in the kitchen. Ruth had taken over the chickens entirely, reporting each day on how many eggs they'd collected as though it were vitally important news. Constance had whittled a small cradle for the baby's doll, which sat prominently in their room waiting for its future occupant. And Margaret had drawn pictures of the family that she insisted be displayed prominently, always making sure to include a small bundle in Georgiana's arms. As winter approached and Georgiana's time drew near, Isaac became increasingly anxious. He'd arranged for Mrs. Patterson to be on call at any hour, had prepared the bedroom with everything the midwife said they'd need, and had even convinced Mrs. Martinez to agree to watch the girls when the time came. He'd also begun sleeping fitfully, waking at every sound Georgiana made in case it was the baby coming. "You're going to exhaust yourself before the baby even arrives," Georgiana had told him one night in early March, about a week before her due date. "I can't help it," Isaac admitted, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm terrified something will go wrong. That I'll lose you or the baby or both. I know it's irrational. I know women have babies every day, but Georgie, I can't bear the thought of anything happening to you." Georgiana took his hand and squeezed it. "I'm scared too," she admitted. "But we have to have faith that everything will be all right. I'm strong, Isaac. I've done this 4 times before, and Mrs. Patterson is one of the best midwives in the territory." He'd nodded, but she could see the fear still lurking in his eyes. She understood it. She felt it too, a low-level terror that accompanied every pregnancy, but seemed more acute now that she had so much to lose. The baby decided to make her entrance on a sunny March morning, 3 days after Georgiana's due date. The contractions started just after dawn, familiar tightening sensations that Georgiana recognized immediately. She'd woken Isaac calmly, told him to fetch Mrs. Patterson and take the girls to Mrs. Martinez, and then had proceeded to labor with an efficiency born of experience. It was faster than any of her previous births, which both relieved and concerned Mrs. Patterson. Less than 6 hours after the first contraction, Georgiana was pushing, gripping Isaac's hand hard enough to leave bruises while he murmured encouragement and love words that she barely heard over the pounding of her own heartbeat. And then there was a cry, sharp and indignant, and Mrs. Patterson was laughing and saying, "It's a boy. You have a son, a son." Georgiana sagged back against the pillows, exhausted and overwhelmed, watching through tears as the midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets. Isaac was crying too, unashamed tears streaming down his face as Mrs. Patterson placed the tiny bundle in his arms. "He's perfect," Isaac whispered, his voice breaking. "Georgie, he's absolutely perfect. Look at him." Georgiana looked and felt her heart expand impossibly larger. The baby was indeed perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would likely turn blue like his father's. His tiny fists waved in the air, and his face was scrunched up in displeasure at having been ejected from his warm, comfortable home into the bright, cold world. "What should we name him?" Isaac asked, carefully transferring the baby to Georgiana's arms. They'd discussed names but hadn't quite decided. Now, looking down at her son, Georgiana knew exactly what felt right. "James," she said. "James Samuel Vaughn, after my father and my first husband, if that's all right with you." "It's perfect," Isaac said, kissing her forehead. "James Samuel, welcome to the world, little man." The girls were allowed in to meet their new brother that afternoon after Georgiana had rested and the bedroom had been cleaned. They crowded around the bed, eyes wide with wonder at the tiny human their mother held. "He's so small," Ruth breathed, reaching out tentatively to touch his hand. James's fingers reflexively curled around hers and she gasped with delight. "Can I hold him?" Dorothy asked, and Georgiana nodded, carefully showing her eldest how to support the baby's head. Dorothy looked down at James with an expression of fierce protectiveness that made Georgiana's throat tighten. She'd worried that the girls might resent a new baby, especially one that would get so much attention, but she should have known better. They'd already proven they had generous hearts. Even little Margaret, who'd been most worried about being displaced, seemed enchanted by her baby brother. "He's wrinkly," she observed with childish honesty, making everyone laugh. "You were wrinkly too when you were born," Georgiana told her. "All babies are. He'll smooth out soon enough." The weeks after James's birth were exhausting but joyful. Isaac had insisted that Georgiana do nothing but rest and care for the baby, taking over all the household duties and enlisting the girls to help. Dorothy became surprisingly efficient at managing her younger sisters, organizing them into a system where everyone had assigned chores. Ruth took pride in being the assistant mother, always ready to fetch clean diapers or warm water. Constance had appointed herself the baby's official entertainer, performing elaborate puppet shows with her whittled animals whenever James was awake. And Margaret had decided that her job was to sing to him, a task she took very seriously, despite her limited repertoire of songs. Isaac was a devoted father, waking with Georgiana for nighttime feedings even though he couldn't do much besides offer support, changing diapers without complaint, and spending long stretches just holding his son and staring at him in wonder. Watching him with James made Georgiana fall in love with him all over again, seeing the gentleness and patience he'd shown her daughters now directed at his own child. Spring turned to summer, and James grew from a tiny newborn into a chunky, happy baby who smiled at everyone and rarely cried. The girls doted on him constantly, competing for who could make him laugh the loudest or who he loved best. Isaac had expanded the cattle operation and had taken on several horses to train, providing a steady income that meant they were no longer just surviving but actually thriving. The store continued to do well, and they'd even been able to hire Miguel full-time, giving them more flexibility with their schedules. On a warm evening in July, almost 2 years to the day since Isaac had first ridden into Abiquiu, Georgiana stood on the porch of their home and surveyed her domain. In the yard, Isaac was teaching Dorothy and Ruth how to properly saddle a horse, his voice patient as he explained each step. Constance and Margaret were playing with Rufus, their laughter carrying on the breeze. And in her arms, James cooed and grabbed at her hair, his blue eyes bright with infant curiosity. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, standing on a different porch in desperate straits, watching her daughters play while her world crumbled around her. She'd been so certain then that she had no prospects, no hope, no future beyond grinding poverty and eventual failure. She'd been prepared to lose everything rather than compromise her principles or her daughter's welfare. And then a cowboy had ridden into town and said the most ridiculous, wonderful thing, that he'd always wanted a full house. He'd taken her desperation and turned it into opportunity. He'd taken her fear and replaced it with security. He'd taken her loneliness and filled it with love so profound, it sometimes still took her breath away. Isaac looked up and caught her watching, and the smile he gave her was full of such devotion and contentment that Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes. He said something to the girls and then walked over, wrapping his free arm around her waist and pressing a kiss to her temple. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "How lucky I am," Georgiana replied honestly. "How completely my life has changed because you were crazy enough to marry a desperate widow with 4 daughters." "I'm the lucky one," Isaac countered. "I was just a drifter with some money saved up, going nowhere in particular, and then I found you, found all of you, found home." He looked out at the girls, at the property they'd built together, at the son in Georgiana's arms. "This, right here, this is everything I ever wanted but never thought I'd have. A wife I love beyond measure, children who make every day an adventure, a place that's truly ours. I thank God every day that you took a chance on me, Georgie. Best gamble I ever made," Georgiana said, leaning into his warmth. "Even if you did ride in with the worst pickup line in history." Isaac laughed, the sound rich and happy. "What, I always wanted a full house didn't sweep you off your feet immediately. It made me think you were insane," Georgiana admitted, grinning. "But it turns out insane was exactly what I needed." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their daughters play while their son dozed in Georgiana's arms. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. The desert stretched out around them, harsh and beautiful and unforgiving, but here in this small pocket of land they'd carved out, there was only love and laughter and the sweet satisfaction of a dream realized. Dorothy called out that she'd successfully saddled the horse by herself, her voice proud, and Isaac squeezed Georgiana's waist before heading back to inspect her work and offer praise. Ruth immediately demanded to try next, while Constance and Margaret abandoned their game to watch. Rufus barked enthusiastically, caught up in the excitement even if he didn't understand what was happening. Georgiana watched her family, her impossible, wonderful, chaotic family that had been cobbled together from desperation and faith and a cowboy's wild offer, and felt a peace so profound it bordered on transcendent. This was what happiness looked like, she thought. Not a fairy tale with perfect circumstances and no troubles, but rather real people choosing each other every day, building something meaningful from whatever materials life provided. James stirred in her arms, making the small snuffling sounds that meant he'd be hungry soon. Georgiana pressed a kiss to his downy head, breathing in that singular baby smell of milk and innocence, and headed inside to nurse him. Through the window, she could see Isaac helping Margaret onto the horse now, supporting her carefully while she squealed with nervous delight. Dorothy and Ruth were arguing about something, probably whose turn was next, but it was good-natured bickering without real heat. Constance had found a stick and was conducting an imaginary orchestra, lost in her own world. By the time James had finished eating and been changed into a clean diaper, the sun had fully set, and the girls were trooping inside, dusty and tired and talking over each other about their equestrian accomplishments. Isaac herded them toward the wash basin, insisting on clean hands and faces before dinner, while Georgiana started heating up the stew she'd made that morning. It was a simple meal, beans and beef and vegetables from the garden they'd planted, but there was plenty of it and it was hot and nourishing. They gathered around the table that Isaac had built when they'd first moved in, each person finding their usual spot with the practiced ease of routine. Isaac said grace, his hand warm over Georgiana's, thanking God for the food and the family and the blessings that had been bestowed upon them. The girls echoed his amen in varying degrees of solemnity, and then the meal began in earnest, with everyone talking at once about their day. After dinner, while the girls cleaned up and Isaac took James for a bit so Georgiana could have a moment to herself, she stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the vast star-filled sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens like a river of light, and she could see constellations that Samuel had taught her the names of years ago. She wondered what he would think of her life now, if he would be happy that she'd found love again or hurt that she'd moved on. But she liked to think he'd approve of Isaac, that he'd be glad his daughters had a good man to guide them, and that Georgiana had found happiness after the hard months following his death. "You all right?" Isaac's voice came from the doorway, gentle with concern. "I'm perfect," Georgiana said, and meant it. Just taking a moment to appreciate everything. He came to stand beside her, James asleep against his shoulder, and together they looked out at the land they'd made their own. In the distance, the cattle lowed softly. Closer, the horses nickered in the barn. Inside the house, the girls were laughing about something, the sound bright and carefree. "We should have another baby," Isaac said suddenly, and Georgiana turned to stare at him in surprise. "James is only 4 months old," she pointed out. "I know, I don't mean right this second," Isaac clarified, grinning. "But eventually, maybe in a year or two, I like the idea of giving him a brother or sister close in age, and I have to admit I wouldn't mind another little one running around. I know I said I wanted to skip the diaper years, but now that I'm in them, they're not so bad." Georgiana considered this, one hand instinctively moving to her stomach. The pregnancy had been difficult and the birth intense, and she was still recovering her strength. But the idea of another baby, another little person who was part her and part Isaac, was undeniably appealing. "Ask me again in a year," she said finally, "when I'm not quite so tired and James is a bit more independent." "That's not a no," Isaac observed with satisfaction. "No, it's not," Georgiana agreed, moving closer to kiss him softly. "You've given me so much, Isaac. A home, security, partnership, love. If you want more children, I'm willing to give you that too." "I want whatever makes you happy," Isaac said seriously. "If you're content with the family we have now, then so am I. I'm not asking for more babies because I think we need them. I'm asking because I love being a father and I love creating life with you and I love watching our family grow. But only if you want it too." "I want it," Georgiana said softly. "Not right now, but yes, I'd like to give James a sibling. Give Dorothy and Ruth and Constance and Margaret another brother or sister. Grow our family a little more before I'm too old to safely have children." They sealed the agreement with a kiss, gentle and sweet under the vast New Mexico sky. James stirred between them, making little sleeping noises, and they both smiled at the small sound. Inside, someone started playing the piano they'd managed to acquire, the notes uncertain but enthusiastic. Ruth's voice rose in song, off-key but joyful, and soon the other girls had joined in. "Come on," Georgiana said, tugging Isaac toward the door. "We're missing the concert." They found the girls gathered around the piano, Dorothy playing with surprising skill considering she'd only had a few months of lessons, while her sisters sang a popular hymn with more enthusiasm than accuracy. When they saw their parents, they immediately demanded that Isaac and Georgiana join in, making room for them in the loose circle. Isaac's voice was a pleasant baritone that blended well with Georgiana's alto, and together they sang until James woke up and added his own crying to the mix, which somehow only made the whole thing funnier. Later, after the girls had been tucked into bed with the usual negotiations about one more story and 5 more minutes, and I'm not tired yet, Georgiana and Isaac collapsed into their own bed, exhausted but content. James was asleep in his cradle beside them, his tiny chest rising and falling with steady breaths. "I love you," Georgiana whispered into the darkness, snuggled against Isaac's side. "I love you too," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "More than I could ever adequately express. You and our children are my entire heart, Georgie. Everything I am, everything I have is yours." She fell asleep to the sound of his heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her ear, and dreamed of the future they would build together. More children, perhaps. Watching the girls grow up and eventually marry and have families of their own. Growing old with this man who had appeared in her life like a miracle when she'd needed one most, the seasons cycled through their familiar patterns. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. James celebrated his first birthday with a small party that saw him more interested in smashing his cake than eating it. The girls continued to grow and thrive, each developing their own personalities and interests more fully. Dorothy began talking about becoming a teacher someday, inspired by her own schooling. Ruth discovered a talent for drawing and filled pages with sketches of the family and the landscape. Constance's whittling progressed to the point where she was creating pieces detailed enough to sell for decent money in Santa Fe. Margaret learned to read and immediately became obsessed with every book she could get her hands on. Isaac expanded the ranch operations further, taking on a hired hand named Tom who was young but hardworking and helped with the cattle and horses. The store continued to prosper, becoming a true gathering place for the community rather than just a place to buy supplies. Georgiana had started hosting a weekly ladies' circle where women could come socialize and work on sewing or knitting projects together, and it had become one of the highlights of her week. As James's second birthday approached, Georgiana realized she was pregnant again. She'd been expecting it, hoping for it even, but the confirmation still brought a flutter of nerves along with the joy. She told Isaac this time while they were working together in the garden, pulling weeds in the mild spring evening while James toddled around examining bugs. "I'm pregnant," she said without preamble, sitting back on her heels to watch his reaction. Isaac dropped the weed he'd been pulling and turned to her with wide eyes. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be without seeing the midwife," Georgiana confirmed. "About 6 weeks along, I think. Which means the baby will come in late November or early December." He was grinning now, that same expression of pure joy he'd worn when she'd told him about James. "Another baby," he said wonderingly. "Georgie, that's wonderful. How are you feeling?" "Tired and nauseous, but I expected that," she said. "The sickness started earlier this time, which Mrs. Patterson says might mean it's a girl, although she also said that's just superstition and there's no real way to know." "A girl would be nice," Isaac mused. "Not that I'd be disappointed with another boy. Healthy is all that matters." "Healthy is all that matters," Georgiana agreed, then yelped as James tried to eat something he'd found in the dirt. Isaac lunged forward to extract whatever it was from their son's mouth, revealing a very confused earthworm that James had apparently thought looked tasty. "Not food, buddy," Isaac told him seriously, setting the worm free. "We've talked about this. Just because it moves doesn't mean you should eat it." Georgiana laughed. watching her husband and son with a heart so full it almost hurt. This life they'd built together was messy and chaotic and far from perfect, but it was theirs, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. The pregnancy progressed much like the first, with the usual discomforts and joys. The girls were excited about another sibling, though Dorothy had started to show the first signs of adolescent self-consciousness and was less overtly enthusiastic than her younger sisters. James, too young to really understand what was happening, just knew that Mama's belly was getting big again, and sometimes he could feel movement if he put his hand just right, which delighted him endlessly. This birth was harder than James's had been, longer and more painful, leaving Georgiana exhausted and frightened as hour after hour passed without progress. Mrs. Patterson remained calm but firm, insisting that everything was proceeding normally even if slowly. And Isaac stayed by Georgiana's side the entire time, holding her hand and offering water and encouragement even as his own fear was evident in his eyes. Finally, after nearly 20 hours of labor, their daughter made her entrance into the world with a lusty cry that proclaimed her displeasure at the entire process. She was smaller than James had been, with a cap of reddish blonde hair that surprised them both and tiny perfect features that made Georgiana cry with relief and love. "She's beautiful," Isaac whispered, cradling his daughter with the same wonder he'd shown holding James for the first time. What should we name her? They'd discussed names but hadn't settled on anything definite. Now, looking at her daughter's scrunched-up face, Georgiana knew exactly what felt right. "Grace," she said. "Grace Caroline Vaughn, after my mother and your sister." "Grace Caroline," Isaac repeated, testing the name. "It's perfect. Hello, little Grace. Welcome to our family." The girls adored their baby sister instantly, each wanting to be the one to hold her or help care for her. Even James, not yet 3, was fascinated by the tiny creature who'd suddenly appeared, gently patting her head with dimpled hands and calling her baby in his limited vocabulary. The house felt somehow even more full, bursting with noise and activity and love in quantities Georgiana hadn't known were possible. Recovering from Grace's birth took longer than it had with James, leaving Georgiana weak and tired for weeks afterward. Isaac had been wonderful, taking over nearly all the household duties and childcare while she regained her strength, never complaining about the extra work or making her feel guilty for needing rest. Dorothy had stepped up as well, proving herself capable of managing her younger sisters and even helping with the babies when needed. By the time Grace was 3 months old and Georgiana had mostly recovered, it was early spring of 1886, nearly 4 years since Isaac had first ridden into her life. They were having dinner one evening, the whole family crowded around the table that now seemed almost too small, when Dorothy cleared her throat importantly. "I've been thinking," she said, with the careful tone of someone who'd rehearsed a speech. "I'm 15 now, almost 16. And I was wondering if maybe I could start working at the store more officially. Not just helping out, but actually learning the business properly. I know you and Isaac are busy with the ranch and the babies, and Miguel is great, but he doesn't know everything about how we do things. I could take over the accounts, maybe, or handle the ordering. I'm good with numbers." Georgiana exchanged a glance with Isaac, seeing her own pride reflected in his eyes. "You are good with numbers," she agreed. "Better than I was at your age. If you're serious about this, about learning the business, then yes, I think that's a wonderful idea." Dorothy's face lit up with a smile that made her look suddenly much younger than her years. "Really, you mean it?" "We mean it," Isaac confirmed. "In fact, I've been thinking it might be time to expand the store a bit, add on another room so we can carry more inventory. If you're interested in learning the business, You should be involved in those decisions too. This will be yours someday, Dorothy. Yours and your sister's. We should make sure you know how to run it properly." The look of gratitude and determination on Dorothy's face made Georgiana's throat tight with emotion. Her eldest daughter was growing up, becoming a young woman with dreams and ambitions of her own. It was bittersweet, watching her babies grow and change, but also deeply satisfying to see the people they were becoming. Ruth spoke up next, encouraged by her sister's success. "I was wondering if I could maybe take some of my drawings to Santa Fe, see if any of the shops there might want to sell them. I know they're probably not good enough, but Mrs. Martinez said she thought people might like them as souvenirs or gifts." "Your drawings are beautiful," Georgiana said warmly. "I think that's an excellent idea. Isaac and I go to Santa Fe for supplies every few weeks. You could come with us on the next trip, visit some shops and see what they say." Constance and Margaret immediately chimed in with their own ideas and plans, the conversation dissolving into enthusiastic chaos that required several minutes to sort out. By the time dinner ended, they'd committed to expansion plans for the store, a trip to Santa Fe to showcase Ruth's artwork, materials for Constance to try more advanced whittling projects, and a promise to find more books for Margaret, whose reading ability had far outstripped the small collection they had at home. After the girls had gone to bed and the babies were down for the night, Georgiana sat with Isaac on the porch, exhausted but happy. "Our family is growing up," she said softly. "They are," Isaac agreed. "Sometimes I can't believe Dorothy is already 15. Seems like just yesterday she was 12 and glaring at me like I was the enemy." "She never really trusted you at first," Georgiana remembered. "She was protecting us. And now she wants to learn the business, wants to be part of building something lasting." Isaac shook his head wonderingly. "We're doing something right, Georgie. These girls, they're turning into remarkable young women." "Thanks in large part to you," Georgiana said, leaning against his shoulder. "You've been an amazing father to them, Isaac, not just to James and Grace, but to all of them. You've given them security and love, and an example of what a good man looks like. They're lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Isaac insisted, as he always did. "You gave me a family when I'd given up on ever having one. You gave me purpose and love and a reason to wake up grateful every morning. Everything good in my life comes from you, Georgiana Vaughn." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. In the distance, an owl hooted, hunting in the cooling evening air. The horses shuffled in the barn, settling down for the night. From inside the house came the faint sound of one of the babies fussing, then quieting again. "You ever think about that day?" Georgiana asked suddenly. "When you first rode into town, all the time," Isaac admitted. "I think about how close I came to just riding straight through Abiquiu, how I almost didn't stop. I was headed for Colorado, actually, heard there was work up there. But my horse needed water and I needed supplies, so I figured I'd stop for an hour or two. And then I saw you on that porch, looking so fierce and so tired and so beautiful, and those 4 little girls chasing tumbleweeds like they didn't have a care in the world. And I thought, this is what I've been looking for. That's simple." Georgiana asked, though her heart was hammering at his words. "That's simple," Isaac confirmed. "I know it probably sounded crazy proposing marriage to a complete stranger. Hell, it was crazy. But sometimes you just know you know. Sometimes something happens, and every instinct you have tells you this is right. This is where you're supposed to be. That's what I felt when I saw you. Like I'd been wandering my whole life looking for home, and suddenly there it was." Georgiana turned to kiss him, deep and lingering, trying to pour into the gesture everything she felt for this man who had saved her and loved her, and given her more than she'd ever dreamed possible. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his. "Best day of my life," she whispered. "The day you rode into town with your crazy proposition and your kind eyes and your full house comment. Best day of my life." "Mine too," Isaac said. "Mine too." The years continued to pass in a blur of growth and change. Dorothy did take over much of the store operations, proving herself to have a keen business sense that saw profits increase steadily. Ruth's artwork began selling well in Santa Fe and eventually in shops as far away as Denver, bringing in money that she proudly contributed to the family coffers while saving some for her own future. Constance's whittling evolved into genuine woodworking, and by the time she was 16, she was creating furniture pieces that were highly sought after. Margaret's love of reading led to her starting a small lending library out of the store, which became unexpectedly popular in their community. James grew into a sturdy, happy little boy who idolized his father and followed him everywhere, learning about ranching and horses and all the skills Isaac possessed. Grace turned out to be a spirited child with a will of iron, keeping everyone on their toes with her adventurous nature and complete lack of fear. Isaac often joked that she was payback for all the trouble he'd caused his own parents, but he said it with such obvious adoration that no one took him seriously. When Dorothy turned 18, she began courting a young man from Santa Fe, the son of one of their suppliers who'd been visiting Abiquiu regularly for business, and had clearly been coming more to see Dorothy than to discuss inventory. His name was William, and he was polite and hardworking and treated Dorothy with a respect that won over both Georgiana and Isaac. They married a year later in a ceremony that left Georgiana weeping with joy and nostalgia, remembering her own wedding to Samuel when they'd both been so young and hopeful. Ruth followed suit at 19, marrying a fellow artist she'd met during a selling trip to Santa Fe. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, a painter rather than a sketch artist, and together they planned to open a gallery that would showcase work from local artists. Georgiana watched her second daughter marry with the same mixture of happiness and bittersweet loss, knowing that this was the natural order of things but missing her baby girl nonetheless. Constance surprised everyone by announcing at 17 that she didn't want to marry, at least not anytime soon. She wanted to focus on her woodworking, maybe even travel to learn from master craftsmen in other parts of the country. Isaac had supported her decision immediately, offering to help finance such a trip when she was ready, and Georgiana had swallowed her old-fashioned objections and agreed that their daughter should pursue her dreams. Margaret, true to form, declared that she was going to become a teacher and help other children learn to love reading the way she did. At 16, she was already assisting at the local school, and the teacher had confirmed that she had a gift for working with young students. James, at 10 years old, was Isaac in miniature, with the same blue eyes and easy smile and love of horses. He'd started helping seriously with the ranch operations, and Isaac had told Georgiana privately that he thought their son would make a fine rancher someday if that was the path he chose. Grace, at 8, was still wild and fearless, but she'd also shown signs of a sharp intelligence that suggested she might follow Margaret into teaching or perhaps into the store business that Dorothy had left behind when she married. It was summer of 1894, 12 years since that fateful day when Isaac had ridden into town, and Georgiana was sitting on the porch of their home watching the sun set over the mountains. She was 45 now, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting against the desert sun. But she felt younger than she had at 33, felt more alive and content than she'd ever imagined possible. Isaac came out to join her, moving a bit more slowly than he once had. At 44, he was still strong and capable, but years of hard work had left their mark. He lowered himself into the chair beside her with a slight groan, then smiled ruefully. "I'm getting old, Georgie." "We both are," she agreed. "But it's a privilege growing old together. Not everyone gets that." "No," Isaac said quietly, thinking of Samuel and of friends they'd lost over the years to accidents or illness or the 100 other dangers of frontier life. "Not everyone does." They sat in comfortable silence, a silence built on 12 years of partnership and love and shared experience. Georgiana thought about everything they'd been through together, all the challenges they'd faced and overcome. The hard years of building the ranch from nothing. The worry and joy of raising 6 children together. The pride of watching those children grow into remarkable young adults. The simple daily pleasure of working side by side with someone who knew her completely and loved her anyway. "You have any regrets?" she asked suddenly. Isaac considered the question seriously before answering. "No, not one. Everything I've done, every choice I've made since riding into Abiquiu that day has led to this. To you and our family and this life. How could I regret any of that? What about your dream of a big ranch operation? We're successful, but we're not wealthy. You could have done more if you didn't have such a large family to support." "I have everything I ever wanted," Isaac said firmly. "More than I wanted, actually. I dreamed of a family, Georgie, not a cattle empire. I dreamed of coming home to people who loved me, of making a difference in the world in some small way, of building something that would last beyond my lifetime. We've done all of that. Our children are going to change this territory for the better, each in their own way. That's a legacy far more valuable than any amount of money or land." Georgiana felt tears prick her eyes, still moved by his words even after all these years. "I love you," she said simply. "I don't say it enough, but I do. I love you more than I ever loved Samuel, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You saved me, Isaac. You saved my daughters. You gave us a life beyond anything I could have imagined in my darkest days." "We saved each other," Isaac corrected gently, reaching across to take her hand. "I was just drifting before I found you, existing but not really living. You gave me purpose, Georgie. You gave me a reason to be the best version of myself. Everything good about me comes from wanting to be worthy of you and those girls who took a chance on a stranger with a crazy proposition." The door opened, and James stuck his head out. "Mama, Papa, Grace won't stop pulling my hair, and Margaret says it's because she likes me, but I think she's just being mean. Tell your sister that if she can't keep her hands to herself, she'll be mucking stalls tomorrow," Isaac said without turning around. "And remind her that we don't pull hair no matter how much we like someone," Georgiana added. "There are better ways to show affection." "Yes, madam," James said, and disappeared back inside. They heard him relaying the message, followed by Grace's indignant protest and Margaret's laughter. "Never a dull moment," Isaac observed with a grin. "Never," Georgiana agreed. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, Georgiana Vaughn reflected on the strange and wonderful path her life had taken. She'd been a widow with no prospects, certain that she'd lose everything, convinced that her daughters' futures were bleak at best. And then a cowboy had ridden into town and offered her the world. He hadn't known he was offering the world, of course. He'd just been a lonely man wanting a family, willing to take on whatever challenges came with that. But in taking on Georgiana and her 4 daughters, he'd created something magical. A blended family that shouldn't have worked but did. A love story that had started with practicality and desperation, but had bloomed into something true and deep and lasting. Inside the house, she could hear her younger children arguing and laughing, the sounds of a family comfortable with each other. Somewhere in town, Dorothy was probably settling her own children down for the night, passing on the love and stability Isaac had given her. Ruth was likely putting finishing touches on a new piece of art while Thomas cooked dinner. Constance might be on a train heading to yet another city to learn new techniques. And Margaret was surely reading by lamplight, unable to put down whatever book had captured her attention. 6 children, each carving out their own path in the world, but all carrying with them the foundation Isaac and Georgiana had built together. Children who knew what love looked like, what partnership meant, what it took to build something lasting. Children who understood that family wasn't just about blood but about choice and commitment and showing up every day even when it was hard. "What are you thinking about?" Isaac asked, recognizing the contemplative look on her face. "About how everything worked out," Georgiana said softly. "About how terrified I was that day you proposed, and how that terror was completely worth it. About how you really did always want a full house, and how you got one beyond anything either of us could have predicted." Isaac laughed, the sound warm and familiar in the darkness. "I did say that, didn't I? I always wanted a full house, seemed like the right thing to say at the time, though I had no idea what I was really signing up for." "Do you wish you'd known?" Georgiana asked, half teasing. "If someone had told you that agreeing to marry me meant 12 years of chaos and noise and constant demands on your time and energy, would you have still done it?" "In a heartbeat," Isaac said without hesitation. "Knowing what I know now, I would have proposed even faster. I would have been even more persistent in convincing you to say yes. Because this, right here, this life we've built together, this is everything that matters. Not the easy days or the quiet moments, but the full, messy, complicated reality of loving people completely and being loved in return." Georgiana stood and moved to sit on Isaac's lap, something she rarely did anymore, but felt compelled to do now. He wrapped his arms around her automatically, pulling her close against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. She thought about how this heart had beaten for her for 12 years now, how this man had chosen her every single day, through good times and bad, through wealth and poverty, through sickness and health, through all the chaos of raising 6 children together. "Thank you," she whispered against his neck, "for riding into town that day, for being crazy enough to propose, for being patient with me while I learned to trust you, for loving my daughters like they were your own, for giving me James and Grace, for being exactly who you are." "Thank you for saying yes," Isaac replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For taking a chance on a stranger, for building this life with me, for every morning I wake up next to you and every night I fall asleep with you in my arms. For making me the luckiest man in New Mexico, maybe in the whole world." They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other in the darkness, listening to the sounds of their children inside and the night sounds of the desert around them. And Georgiana thought that if she could go back to that desperate, terrified woman standing on a different porch 12 years ago, she would tell her that everything was going to be all right. More than all right. That the cowboy with the kind eyes and the crazy proposition was going to give her everything she'd lost, and more besides. That love could be built as well as fallen into, constructed carefully through daily choices and small kindnesses and unwavering commitment. That sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and the greatest loves start with the simplest words. "I always wanted a full house."